picked up the phone, and it's like, Steve, we got a problem. I said, okay, what happened? He says, we've been hacked.
The president did say the federal government is ready to help local election officials if it turns out their voting machines are vulnerable to hackers.
Homeland Security is considering declaring the election a, quote, critical infrastructure.
There's always a certain amount of noise that goes on out there. And so on election night itself, we did not see anything that affected the ballot count.
There's a piece by Hans von Spakovsky, who is a great writer, at Conservative Review, where I am editor-in-chief. And I can't read it all, but you've been hearing talk about election cybersecurity and concerns about that, right? You've heard people on the right talk about it, on the left. And he points out in here, do you know who's pushing the alert button about this the most? Jeh Johnson, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, a.k.a. the Department of Homeland Insecurity. He had a big phone meeting on this. And when he was asked by the Louisiana Secretary of State, Tom Shedler, whether there was any evidence, any credible evidence whatsoever, that there's a threat to our election system, Johnson said no.
I think it's important to note that on election night, and we had our guard up for this. Our cyber experts at DHS we had our crisis action team ready. On election night, we did not see anything that amounted to altering ballot counts or degrading the ability to report election results or anything, nothing out of the ordinary. There's always a certain amount of noise that goes on out there. And so on election night itself, we did not see anything that affected the ballot count.
And that's the notion that there's an Obama shadow government embedded in the bureaucracy that is working against this new president. I think some folks are going to think that's right on, and some folks will think it's awfully conspiratorial.
Well, I would love to claim credit for that, but actually I think a reporter by the name of Glenn Greenwald at The Intercept, who has got a relationship with, what's his name, Assange, I think he actually coined the term, and I think it works. I don't think who's driving this business that the Russians hacked the election? It's the Democrat Party. It's Hillary. It's Obama. It's all those people who just can't accept that.
And you think they're behind the leaks too?
Absolutely. Of course they are. They're trying. Look, they can't win at the ballot box. You know they're down 1,200 seats since 2010. They've become a marginal party electorally. All they've got is their embeds in the bureaucracy and the judiciary, and they're pulling out all the stops. There's no question. This business that the Russians hacked the election, this is serious allegation that is impossible. The Russians could not have had any impact whatsoever on voting, either how they were cast or how they were counted. In fact, if you want to say they did their job. Hillary won the popular vote. In fact, if you want to say they did their job. Hillary won the popular vote. Hillary won the popular vote.
The Department of Homeland Security understand that they're following up on some of these rumors that they would like to get involved in making sure our elections are not rigged. But you and I remember back in those days, right after, I don't know how many months after 9/11 occurred, but not too long after that, they lined up to change things so far forever from 9/11. But you remember exactly when that bill was coming up, and I'm sure it didn't take us a whole long time to figure it out, but I know you read it in detail.
Well, it started at 20-some pages. Then it went to the House, and it became, I think, something like 200 pages. When it was finally passed, it was almost 600 pages. And it was passed with such quickness that it was impossible for anyone to read it. But they promised us that it would streamline government. This was not adding more deck chairs. No, this was streamlining the government. It's going to make it go more smoothly. You, unfortunately, didn't buy into that, and you had a different view. This is you back in 2002. Rest assured that this new department represents a huge increase in the size and scope of the federal government that will be used mostly to serve, to spy on the American people.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good prediction, but you don't need a real high IQ to figure that out, because all you have to do is have a little bit of common sense, know a little bit about government, just observe for a short period of time what's happened to our government, and those are the conclusions that any rational person should come to. But we didn't have too much support from the Republicans. There were just a few of us, and I think we only have one in the Congress now that actually opposed the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, Representative Duncan, who's on the board of the Institute.
Yes, right. But they're in charge of a lot. I can't name all the agencies, but I do know it's everything from the TSA to the Coast Guard. This is a tremendous amount of responsibility they have. But if you want to talk about expansion and control and centralization of government, I think that it's very clear that is what has happened, and I am quite sure that the number of employees that we have for the government since 9/11 is very much greater, and they're very much involved in our personal lives, our personal privacy, overrunning state laws, the whole works. So this next step to take over elections is pretty scary as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and what they want to do is the Secretary of the Homeland Security Department, Jeh Johnson, said he is looking into designating our election process, our voting system, as, quote, critical infrastructure, which would therefore fall under the purview of Homeland Security. And I think they have 16 other areas of critical infrastructure that they're in charge of, roads and bridges and reservoirs and things of that nature. So,
well, usually when they come up with something, even war, they have to have a pretext, and the pretext is pretend. How are we going to deceive the people? How are we going to scare the people? So they're having a pretext for this, because there has been talk, and most people think the elections are probably rigged. I certainly think they are, because no matter what happens, the same deep state controls everything. So our definition of rigging is different from one to another. But, they got involved a little bit in foreign policy in order to, justify this. And it's always national security. And what is it that they're saying now that is justifying what we're doing?
What's going on here? After 9/11, folks, Congress passed the Homeland Security Act of 2001, allowing the President or the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to designate, quote, critical infrastructure, unquote, that must be protected against attacks. In 2013, Obama issued a revised presidential policy directive on critical infrastructure security and resilience. So Jeh Johnson's talking about the possibility of designating election booths as critical infrastructure. Now, why would he do that? To protect it from non-existent threats? His words. Non-existent cyber attack threats? Now, Hans points out if Jeh Johnson designates our election system as critical infrastructure, then according to this directive, the Department of Justice is given the authority to, quote, investigate, disrupt, prosecute, and otherwise reduce, unquote, threats to that infrastructure. That is, DHS will coordinate the overall federal effort to promote the security and resilience of the infrastructure. The voting booth in your neighborhood. Given the lack of credible threat of a cyber attack, there could be another explanation for what Jeh Johnson's up to. Designating election systems as critical infrastructure could grant Secretary Johnson, Department of Homeland Security officials, and officials at the Department of Justice, please listen to this, access to any and every election and to any and every voting location they deem threatened. The government would be able to police the systems that is the federal government, and could demand changes be made to election and voting systems regardless of the views of state and local officials. Do you hear me? He points out the federal government's actions could stem from the administration's frustration over the 2013 Shelby County decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, about which Attorney General Loretta Lynch has loudly complained, claiming it severely curtailed the ability of the Department of Justice to send official observers recruited by OPM, that is the Office of Personnel Management in Washington, to polling places. These officials can only go where a court has given them authorization to be present. Otherwise, the Justice Department is dependent on local jurisdictions, giving them permission for its lawyers and staff to be there. Many jurisdictions have wised up and have started saying no to the Department of Justice. That must be very frustrating to the partisans who inhabit parts of the department these days and want their staff out there making sure their political friends get elected. In fact, Richard Pilger of the Election Crimes Unit of the Public Integrity Section of the Criminal Division at the Justice Department was a participant in that phone call I just mentioned with the Secretaries of State. And Chris Herron, the chief of the voting section of the Federal Civil Rights Division, was also a participant in a call last week on this subject with Leslie Reynolds, the executive director of the National Association of Secretaries of State. Neither Pilger nor Herron know anything about cybersecurity. The Civil Rights Division has absolutely no expertise on that subject whatsoever and has no jurisdiction, no authority over the issue.
Well, apparently some voter enrolls in Arizona and Illinois were hacked. That would be the names of the addresses of voters and that sort of thing. So it really technically didn't have anything to do with the outcome. At least in Illinois, they're not even connected to the internet when they vote. So it was data about voters. But immediately they said, it was Russian hackers who did it. Without any evidence, they didn't have any evidence that it was. But as you point out, it gives it this foreign dimension. And as we've seen in the media over the past week or so, certainly the Clinton campaign has bent over backwards to try to convince everyone that Putin's hand is inside the Trump puppet.
Right.
So you put the two together and you think, okay, Putin is going to rig the elections for Trump. Therefore, we got to get Homeland Security involved to save us from the rigging.
Yes, and there's also stories, obviously off the wall, that if an individual, articles saying, well, if one of the candidates dies, but the elections could be held up pretty easily. I'm not sure that is in the law, but law doesn't mean anything, so it depends on the chaos. And this goes along with some work that we have done on emergency powers. The president can declare emergency, and he really can take over. This is just more like centralizing those powers into one unit. But the president has ominous powers under declaration, and the Congress doesn't have to vote on that particular thing. They already have. They grant it. If there's a declaration of an emergency, they can do this, and the president can take over, which obviously is on the books, very scary. And now they're doing this. So Secretary Johnson emphasized in this Monday call he wanted to make the federal government available to states to prevent cyber attacks, but nothing prevents the department from making recommendations now. No critical infrastructure designation is required. Johnson said he was organizing a federal state working group that would include DHS, DOJ, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, an agency of the Department of Commerce. Johnson was still considering, quote unquote, whether he would be, quote, designating some aspect of the election process as critical infrastructure, unquote. But Georgia's Secretary of State Brian Kemp was very vocal in the telephone call on Monday, telling Johnson the states don't need any help from the federal government. You see, the realistic fear is that this is the first step towards nationalizing election administration. Federal officials have already shown they will not hesitate to use their power to tilt public policy in favor of their own personal political agenda could bring that same bias to decisions that affect the very integrity of our election process. That is, ladies and gentlemen, the nationalization of the voting booth. I went back
to some of the original debates at the state ratification conventions. And it came up in almost every state. They insisted that that process be controlled by the states. Again, they would not have ratified the Constitution if their authority had been undermined. And the authority is with the states, not with the federal government. And so once again, the despotic types that are the Obama employees, cabinet, and Obama himself are looking for ways to federalize, to nationalize our elections. Ooh, nationalism, populism. No. Republicanism, federalism, and constitutionalism. The federal government must not be allowed to nationalize our voting booths. It is a state function. It is a state function. And you know damn well what the left-wing kooks in the federal bureaucracy, particularly the Uncivil Rights Division of the Department of Injustice, are up to.
A new intelligence report claims Russia tried to influence our election but did not target vote tallying. Still, Homeland Security Secretary Jeh Johnson just declaring our election infrastructure as critical. That means the federal government can do more to help protect polling places, vote tabulation locations, and voting machines.
I'm satisfied that this had my attention. It had the attention of my people because I pushed them at every step of the way to make sure we were doing everything we could do. But obviously there are lessons learned from this experience, and for the future there's probably more we can and should do.
For the states, if I remember correctly, you had a conference call or otherwise communicated with the states to offer them your assistance prior to the election.
Correct.
And if I remember your testimony correctly, their response vacillated between neutral and opposed.
Correct. Well, it was to the issue of designating them as critical infrastructure.
Okay.
Correct.
Do you know, without naming the states, whether any of the states most vocally opposed to that designation were, in fact, impacted by Russian efforts?
I'd have to look at both lists. If you're saying impacted, were those states that had their voter registration databases scanned and perhaps infiltrated? I'd have to look at both lists, sir. I don't have that information off the top of my head.
Yeah, what I'm wondering is if any of the states most vocal in rejecting your help actually needed it the most.
Well, again, they didn't reject our help. 36 of them accepted our help, but they were resisting the idea of a designation to be critical infrastructure, which I went ahead and did anyway. They were resisting the idea of a designation to be critical infrastructure, which I went ahead and did anyway.
Federal Commissioner, Department of Homeland Security election power grab raises huge questions and red flags. Remember, we talked about the potential of the Secretary of DHS, this lightweight, this clown, Jeh Johnson. And they kept showing ankle on the effort to try and nationalize the elections. Well, guess what they just did? Jeh Johnson rushed through a designation of the nation's state and local election systems as, quote, critical infrastructure, unquote. Why now, after the election, and in the waning days of the Obama administration? And Hans is right. Christy McCormick, a commissioner on the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, EAC, is raising these questions and even more serious inquiries about Johnson's actions. The EAC is the federal agency charged with being the national clearinghouse and resource for state and local election officials on the best practices and standards in administering elections. So why is DHS bigfooting all over the EAC's turf? In announcing the designation, Johnson declared that elections should be a priority for cybersecurity assistance and protection from the federal government. The January 6th designation, he said, was simply the right and obvious thing to do. Yet the formal designation itself admitted that many states and local election officials are opposed to this designation. The day before the announcement, Johnson had a nationwide telephone conference call with election officials. And according to McCormick, it was billed by DHS as a call to inform them of Johnson's current thinking on whether or not to designate elections as critical infrastructure. So he deceived them. At the same time, McCormick said election officials were still asking for information about the designation. After all, she noted Johnson had never conducted a discussion or review of what the designation means or its benefits. And she added, election officials have never been given an adequate opportunity to engage in decision-making process. Rather, she said, Johnson discarded and dismissed the opinions and concerns of the Secretaries of State and the EAC commissioners, the very people who actually have deep professional experience in conducting and administering elections. His unilateral action, she said, blindsided election officials in our states. In fact, McCormick said that when they spoke with or were briefed by DHS officials on other occasions, sometimes even less than an hour later, there was different or additional information provided by or leaked by the media by DHS officials. So essentially, McCormick argues Johnson borrowed a pen and phone from his outgoing boss in a Friday night drop, and the designation is near all-encompassing, covering virtually everything that state and local election officials do and giving federal officials unprecedented access to state databases. And the designation is near all-encompassing, covering virtually everything that state and local election officials do and giving federal officials unprecedented access to state databases. And giving federal officials unprecedented access to state databases. McCormick raised the same issue, questioning the so-called benefits of this designation, and also said that serious questions still remain about the roles of other federal agencies, such as the Department of Justice. During the conference call with Johnson, he told election officials their participation was voluntary. However, he did say that if they didn't volunteer, they would not be able to receive information from DHS to secure their own systems, McCormick notes. And McCormick further argues that Johnson's action politicizes elections. He bypassed the EAC, which was set up by Congress as a bipartisan, independent agency to guard against having elections handled or governed by a partisan branch of the federal government that is under the control of whatever party occupies the White House. She also points out that this designation creates a layer of non-transparency and unnecessary federally controlled bureaucracy. Elections need to be transparent. This is why the states allow outside observers at all levels of the election process. But McCormick notes the critical infrastructure designation departs from that transparency standard and provides for the establishment of numerous councils and centers that will be out of the view of the public and run solely by federal bureaucrats. But McCormick notes the critical infrastructure designation departs from that transparency standard and provides for the establishment of numerous councils and centers that will be out of the view of the public and run solely by federal bureaucrats. This is very, very bad, folks. She observes closed discussion or control of election administration by various councils and groups out of the view of the public does not engender faith or confidence in the elections. All right, let me cut to the chase. They just nationalized the election processes in our localities and states. They just nationalized them by claiming an emergency. Now, how many times have we been concerned about them claiming an emergency for this or that in order to come in and federalize and nationalize something? Well, they just did it. And now what they're going to do is slowly, step by step, take it over. Oh, we don't like where you have that polling place. Oh, no. You have to have officials that do X, Y, Z at the... No. The officials have to speak 4 languages. Oh, no. The bathrooms at the polling place have to look like that. This is just the beginning. Just the beginning. They have now nationalized our polling places. Congress didn't do it. There was no public debate about it. There were no hearings. On the way out the door, this clown Jeh Johnson, who can't secure the border, who can't protect the country, this jerk has decided that this is what he's going to do. And I guarantee you he got the order from Obama. I guarantee you he got the order from Obama. They hate federalism. They hate state sovereignty. They hate individual liberty. They hate mobility. They want uniformity, conformity, centralized, iron-fisted leftism. And that's what they just did. They just did it. And you haven't heard a damn thing about it on network cable or satellite TV. I read the available material on the state ratification conventions. And several of them insisted that the details of the election process be left with the states or they would never ratify the Constitution. And that's exactly what the Constitution does. That's exactly what the Constitution does. It's why states decide what times the polls will be open. States decide where the polls will be. States decide on election judges and all the rest of it. States decide on whether there's early voting and those sorts of things. States decide when there's absentee voting. Now, and I guarantee you, because that's what these statists do, now they have taken the first step in nationalizing the process of state and local elections. And he did it under cover of dark, and he did it in the last minute, and he did it on purpose. And nobody's talking about it. Everybody's flat-footed. Instead, the liberal media has us chasing shiny objects again.